Hey, so welcome to this evening's webinar. I'm Jo, I'm one of the assistant heads at Penn Green, so I'll be chairing this evening's webinar, but you don't really want to listen to me, so I'm going to hand you over straight away to Kerry, whose presentation this evening is around play and neurodiversity. So we'll finish, or Kerry will finish around about, we'll kind of leave 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions, but I'll keep my eye on the chat. So if anybody's got anything that they want to contribute or say as we go, I'll be keeping my eye on that. So hope you have a lovely evening, and I'll speak to you again at the end. Over to you, Kerry.
Fab, thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar this afternoon, where I'm going to be talking to you about self-directed play, neurodiversity, specifically thinking about children with lifelong developmental differences and disabilities and its relation to child development. So I'm really excited to be here this afternoon to talk about this topic, because I think it's a really important one, and it also informs my doctorate research that I am currently in the messy, chaotic part of at the moment. Just to give you a brief introduction to me, I am Kerry. I'm an early childhood specialist, and I have worked in early childhood now for 18 years, working with babies, toddlers and preschoolers, but I also have experience working in school-based settings and within local authority as well. So I worked for many years as an area inclusion consultant. And it was during my time as an inclusion consultant that I really come to challenge some of my perceptions around children's play. I myself am also neurodivergent. I am autistic and ADHD, and I will often draw upon my own lived experiences, but general lived experience frameworks to really inform how we come to understand developmental differences and disabilities, and really challenging some of the deficit narrative that unfortunately still exists within kind of the realm of inclusion at the moment. I'm also a lecturer at Goldsmiths University in London, so that is my day job. I work on the undergrad, the postgrad and the PGCE programmes, and what's really interesting about that is I get to go into primary education and advocate for the importance of play for play's sake in that space as well. So even though my background and my passion is very much that 0 to 5 age phase, and being able to go into primary and try to inform and influence some of the standardization that we see within education is really important. On top of my day job, I'm an author, writer and trainer, and that's where I get my professional oxygen. Because I am in a higher education environment, it's within my freelance role that I get to actually be with my people, with early years educators, within early childhood spaces, and I gain a lot from that. And then finally, as I said earlier, I am a doctorate student, so I am currently at Sheffield University. I'm in my 3rd year, and essentially when I was working in local authority, and I'm going to go on to share some anecdotes across this afternoon session, what I noticed is that I was sometimes upholding really outdated ideas about the way disabled and neurodivergent children played, and so really kind of peddling this idea that, oh, play doesn't come naturally to children with developmental differences, and we need to teach them how to play, or we need to support them to play in more purposeful or functional or appropriate ways. And so what I think is a really good starting point for this webinar is recognizing that some of what I'm going to be talking about are things that I have also had to grapple with, and I'm still grappling with, in terms of some of my own misperceptions of play in early childhood. And so within my doctorate, what I am basically arguing for is the fact that play is innate. It comes naturally to all children, regardless of their disability, regardless of their neurotype, and it's on us to develop a deeper understanding of not only the patterns of different types of play, but recognizing that play has different cultures as well. As I said, I'm in that point of my doctorate where I'm totally lost and confused, that I don't even know if I could try and define or explain play at the moment, but I'm going to give it a good go across this evening, or across this afternoon rather. So what am I going to be doing? We're going to be essentially exploring the role of play in human development, but we're going to be thinking about play amongst those children whose play might look different, whose play might not necessarily make immediate sense to us, whose play might be defined as atypical. And we're going to think about the importance of ensuring that play is accessible to all children and that we challenge some of our perceptions around that. So we're going to think about why does there still exist the idea that neurodivergent and disabled children can't play, or they can't play functionally or appropriately, and how do we start to challenge that? And so I'll be giving some explanations and illustrating that across the webinar. The next goal is to consider ableism and play. So ableism might be something that you have heard of before. And quite essentially, we're going to unpick it in a bit more detail, but it is the favouring of typical minds and non-disabled bodies. So it's this idea that there is a right way to be and that we should be helping children to all strive for this right way to be, what we would often refer to as normal or normalcy. And when we promote this idea, we end up rejecting or denying different ways of being. So it's kind of very anti-diversity. And unfortunately, it's something that shows up when we are supporting and facilitating and engaging in play that looks different. And so I'm going to finish the webinar by thinking about the ways in which we can apply a neuro-affirming lens to play. As I go through this webinar, and please do feel free to share your own expertise, your own ideas, your own thoughts, and you can use the chat, or if you do feel confident to jump on the audio. It's really important to recognize that you as educators are in practice. You are with these children every day, so you will have such intricate insights and knowledge about children's play. And it's about really, my doctorate is really about listening to educators' perceptions and the ways in which you are advocating the right for all children to play. So why are we here today then? Neurodiversity might be something that you're already very familiar with. It might be something you're quite confident with. It certainly is a buzzword in education at the moment, and it's an important buzzword. It's something that I myself am very passionate about, but we want to ensure that within an educational sense that it's being used in a way that really empowers and cultivates meaningful inclusion. So I'm just going to give a very brief definition to set the scene today, because we're thinking about play in a neurodiverse context, particularly thinking about neurodivergence in play. And so this just kind of sets the foundations. The first thing to recognize is that when I use the term neurodiversity, I am literally referring to all of humanity. That term relates to all of us, regardless of the developmental pathway or the lived experiences that you have. We exist within a neurodiverse world, and its very simple meaning is it's that recognition that humans are inevitably, and we should expect humans to have a range of differences. Dr. Nick Walker, who is a neurodiversity advocate, will often refer to the fact that actually there are infinite ways in which our bodies and minds will develop across our lifespan, and actually those variabilities, those differences are essential to humanity's survival. So we need to recognize that the diversity of how we present as humans, the way our bodies and minds are presented in the world, everybody has value, everybody is valid, and nobody is less than because they have a different experience from the norm. So neurodiversity is that recognition of the infinite variation of human minds and bodies. And you might hear some associated language when you hear the term neurodiversity. So you might hear people referring to those who are neurotypical or who conform to neurotypicalism. And that essentially refers to those children and adults who generally follow a typical developmental trajectory. It's really important to recognize that those who conform to neurotypicalism, the society, the world is designed for those people, and that's why we still have such issues of exclusion and othering of those who are different, because actually we live in a world that favors this typically developing pathway. You also have emergent and emergent neurodivergent people. So when we think about children in early childhood, neurodivergent refers to those whose development diverges from what is typical. Now, when the term diverge is used, it's not to say that they diverge and they are less than, or they are deficit or disordered or impaired. Those children, those adults are just on a different developmental pathway. So within your early education setting, whilst you will be supporting a variation of differences and needs within your setting, neurodiversity is about affording everybody holistic understanding. Why that's relevant to early childhood is that at the moment there is still a tendency, despite some really amazing work, including amazing work by Penn Green, but there is still a tendency to focus on the ways in which those with lifelong developmental differences and disabilities, there is still an emphasis on, oh, well, there's something wrong with that person or child, or they are they have lots of red flags, or there's a problem, or there's a concern, or a deficit, or an impairment. And so neurodiversity is actually rejecting this idea that that's the only way to describe those children. It's about affording them that holistic understanding that all children, all humans have strengths, interests, differences, and needs. So the other really important thing to recognize with neurodiversity is it is a neutral term. You will often hear neurodiversity talked about in relation to superpowers, and let's celebrate everybody, and everyone's got loads of strengths, and let's take celebratory approaches, and all those things can be wonderful. But neurodiversity isn't just about focusing on the positive. It's about recognizing that as humans, we are dynamic, complex, messy, chaotic at times. And so we will have a range of strengths, differences, and challenges across our lifespan. So it very much is a neutral term that we would use within our educational spaces. Now, the reason it's important to recognize neurodiversity in relation to play is because something that we know all children will do in their earliest years, they are born to do it. It is something that comes naturally. It is something that is innate, is that they will play. We know that that is part and parcel of our early human development. It's why we state it as a right for all children. It's why we advocate for it in early childhood spaces. But the problem that we face and we still encounter in our early childhood spaces through our policymakers, through our perceptions, through theory, is this idea that you've got children that play in the right way and children that play appropriately and children that play functionally. And then you have children that don't quite know how to play. Their play isn't okay. They play in the wrong way. Their play doesn't come naturally to them. And what that leads to is us actually overlooking that all children are playing. They do just play in different ways. There's also a real issue with play often being appropriated. And when I say that, there is this idea that unless we can extract something from play, unless we can say it is connected to learning, unless we can say that we can get something from it, then it's considered not valuable. So play in its kind of description is that play is just something that happens. It happens for play's sake. All children do it. But we've kind of taken it in early childhood and we've tried to create it into this productive thing. So many of us will talk about learning through play, for example. Whilst that is important, learning through play is really important, it can also suggest that if a child is just resting through play or processing through play or relieving through play, or idly playing, then that's not valuable. And that's what we need to challenge, because play is inherently valuable in whatever form it takes. And so in early childhood spaces, we're not just thinking about play as a right, but we're actually also thinking about play as a basic human need. Children absolutely need it, and they need plenty of opportunity for what we would refer to as self-directed play, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about this evening. And then, yes, we absolutely need to recognize that play is a right. It's not a privilege. Unfortunately, however, we know that certain groups or certain characteristics in children mean that they don't get their right to play. They don't have opportunities for that uninterrupted play. And so that can then become denied, meaning that actually upholding those rights is really, really difficult. Play is also communicated in space. So a lot of the work that I do in early childhood settings is thinking about how do our neurodivergent children play, and how does the space communicate to those children that the way that they play is okay, that it is valuable, because there can be a lot of emphasis. And again, because we're often pressured to get children school ready, we're often pressured to reduce children's unruly play in order to get them to sit still and to use whole body listening and to comply. And actually, a lot of the time, our environment can be communicating the opposite about play, that children shouldn't be using their whole bodies, that they shouldn't be movement driven, that they shouldn't be engaged in special interests, that they shouldn't be stimming. And again, when I say that, it's not about an individual criticism to settings or to individual educators. It's recognizing that our system often denies us those opportunities to really revel and be play-filled in our everyday lives. And then the final thing, oh, hello?
Hiya, it's Jo. There's a comment in the chat that just says the whole diagnostic process of autism and ADHD is negative and medicalized. It's all about disorder, difficulty, and deficit. Until that changes, we have that language imposed on us as adults and children.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that the name is peer educator, I can see it as.
Yes.
So you're absolutely right. At the moment, we exist within a framework that is driven by a medicalized model of disability. So, for example, even though I identify as an autistic person, my diagnosis says I have autism spectrum disorder, and I absolutely reject that I am a disordered human. I have a different way of perceiving and being in the world, and I absolutely do have challenges, as do many autistic people, but also typically developing people also have challenges. There may be different levels of salience, or things might be more noticeable, but again, the reason that autistic people and other neurotypes are often considered disordered is because the problem is situated in the individual rather than recognizing it's our society that I would actually say is quite disordered, because it only accounts for one type. Oh, sorry, Tanya, because it only accounts. And I think what Tanya's saying there, until we get rid of that system, and that is the long-term aim, that we actually, when I say get rid, we don't want to get rid of a medical system, but we want to reduce the medicalization of neurodivergence. Once we reduce that and we have that more holistic understanding of human difference, then we can see that change. I'm going to be really candid. We're not going to see that in our lifetime. We're not, because it is embedded and entrenched across our society and within our education system, unfortunately. So one of the problems that we do have is the medical system of diagnosing humans translates into the way we then treat those children within our educational spaces. But what we have to recognize is that every time we advocate for human difference over human disorder, we are pulling at threads. And this is what helps me to continue getting up every day and coming to my job, is that for every thread that you pull, you are eventually unraveling the whole damn thing. So you might not be around to see that full unraveling, but by advocating for neurodiversity and advocating for, in this case, what Tanya has referred to, autistic identity, we have to pull at those threads. And we have to start that from early childhood. Educators can often be surprised when I go in and they're not necessarily familiar with neurodiversity. They're often surprised, oh, these things start to take place in early childhood. This deficit approach to childhood or to neurodivergence begins from those earliest years. So thank you so much, Tanya, for sharing. And you are absolutely right. And I would love to know the ways in which you're pulling at those threads as well. So just to go back to where we are, so play is a human need. We all need it. It's a right and it should not be considered a privilege. The spaces in which we exist communicate the affordance of play, particularly play that looks different. And one of the things that I am exploring in the relation to early childhood is this notion of neuroqueering, which originates from queer theory. And basically what it is essentially about is that children, in the way that they play, are often actually subverting, resisting kind of neuronormativity. So children play in lots of weird and wonderful ways. They often play in ways that we kind of think, that makes no sense to me, or why is the child motivated by that? Or we might think, oh, that's silly, or it's wild, or it's chaotic. And play can make us feel sometimes, because it can be so entangled in lots of different things, it can feel like it falls outside of the norm. And so neuroqueering is quite literally that concept of rejecting normalcy, rejecting being normal through the way in which you play. And what a lot of play advocates, and particularly neurodivergent play advocates, argue is that we should really tune into the different ways in which our children naturally will neuroqueer. They will use play in order to show their understanding and position in the world. And Lester and Russell, you know, kind of really caution, they caution against defining play. So what a lot of play researchers say is you can't define play. It's too ambiguous, it's too mysterious, it's too infinite. You can't kind of put it into a neat box. And the minute you try to put parameters around play, actually you're then stifling the existence of play. But what they do recognize is that play is a unique way of being. It's a behavior that involves perceiving, feeling, and acting in the world. Now, when Lester and Russell use the term play, they're actually referring to what is known as self-directed play. And self-directed play is that which is initiated and chosen by the child. So within your early childhood settings, you are likely offering a whole range of play experiences. You are likely offering a play spectrum of experiences. But what we know is that actually what children need a really good amount of is this self-directed play. What we also know is that those children who are neurodivergent and disabled are often taken away from their self-directed play to engage in interventions, to engage in adult-led strategies, to get play-based support. And while those things might be useful for children, what it actually means is that we're losing opportunities to really think about, okay, why does that child engage in that particular play pattern? What does that intrinsically mean for that child? So if you're taking children away from play, or if you are seeing that play as not valuable, then actually we're missing those golden threads of learning. We're missing those golden threads of information about how that child is making sense of their world. So it is a behavior that involves perceiving, feeling, and acting in the world. Children engage in play by taking time and space for their own needs and desires, which helps them to develop flexible and adaptable responses to their environment. What's really important to note is that as humans, we have a whole lifetime of having to follow the rules. We have a whole lifetime of trying to fit into the world. We have a whole lifetime of having to behave in socially acceptable, whatever that means, ways. Children have this real small amount of time, particularly in the UK and England, this really short amount of time to just be who they are. You know, 0 to 4, some children enter reception at age 4 and they start getting trained for that conformity, for that productivity, for that compliance. So if we in the early years can really grasp every opportunity to let them have play-filled lives, that's really going to contribute to a strong play identity. And that's some of what I'm wanting to think about this afternoon. And we're going to think about it in relation to focusing on this self-directed play, this play for play's sake. So this webinar is not really about direct instruction. It's not about play-based learning. It's certainly not about play-based intervention. That's a webinar for a whole other time. It more thinks about what is intrinsically motivated in your children. What are they drawn to? And the very purpose of this webinar is thinking about how do we actually then value that type of play? How do we value it, even though it might not always make sense to us? And this is particularly important for children who are neurodivergent or disabled, because they often have their play misjudged or misinterpreted because of this, as Tanya has spoken about, because of this medicalized model of disability. It often is viewed as, oh, that's a sign that there's a problem within their play, and that is some of what we're challenging. And I'm going to talk about that in relation to a couple of anecdotes now. I'm just going to come back to Tanya's comment. I challenge every single person I encounter, whether that's my children, therapist, GP and friends, to use neuro-affirming. So I'm going to say something that's quite provocative here. Condition is as bad as disorder. If you look at the definition of condition, it actually has worse connotations than disorder. And many people will now say condition over disorder, but both of those terms are essentially wedded together. The best language you can use to use neuro-affirming language. So absolutely keep challenging everybody you encounter, but you might want to refer to neurotype. So the type of neurodivergence a person has. They don't have a condition. They don't have a disorder. They have a neurotype. So yeah, that might be helpful, but it's really good that you are challenging that and thinking about that neuro-affirming language. But yeah, just to say, people would challenge the use of condition as well. And it's worth having a look at that, but it is really good that you're advocating for that neuro-affirming language. So I'm going to share a couple of anecdotes about the ways in which play in neurodivergent children can be misperceived or misinterpreted. And I'm actually going to draw upon an example from my own practice. As I said earlier on, I worked for 6 years in a local authority, and I would go out and observe children all the time at play, and I would provide advice about how to provide further provocations and invitations, how to extend their learning, how to build upon their interests. And whilst my specialism was within inclusion, I had myself, even as a neurodivergent person, my training had been, okay, your role is to go in and to essentially fix the problem. So if a child doesn't know how to play, or a child doesn't know how to interact, you're going in, you're identifying what the concern is, and you are fixing it. And it was, you know, I look back now and I think, well, I wasn't trained in the right way, because I absolutely do not hold that view anymore. But when I went out into settings as an area inclusion consultant, I would go in and I would observe. And what I noticed is that if I was observing a typically developing child at play, I would, and I've used that word a lot today already, I would afford that child a much kind of more play-driven, holistic understanding. So I'm going to use the very common example that we hear when we talk about play in neurodivergence, which is lining things up. So if I was observing a typically developing child and I noticed that that child was lining things up, I found within my own perception that I would be like, wow, this is really fascinating. Hattie loves lining things up, and she's creating these patterns, and she's categorizing, and she's organizing, and this must be all part of her schematic development. This is giving her an intrinsic motivation. This is contributing to a wider knowledge base. Let's build upon that schema. Let's plan more activities around her schema. And I would get really excited, because I was like, well, that's part of typical development. That's what we would expect children to see. So just by knowing that Hattie was typical, the way I perceived her play and indeed her learning was through this asset-based lens, this celebratory lens, this strengths-led lens. However, then again, and there was a different child who happened to be on a diagnostic pathway, for example, Jamel here, who is autistic, and Jamel is doing the exact same thing that Hattie is doing, lining things up, enjoying that categorization, showing a strong preference for repetition in his play. Because of the way I've been trained about what it is to be autistic, I would suddenly look at that lining things up, that repetition, that categorization, that organization, and I would see it as a symptom. So I would say, oh, okay, so Jamel is lining things up. That must be a symptom of his autism. And we need to think about how we're going to redirect his lining things up so he plays in more appropriate ways. So what you can see through that very simple anecdote, when a child is playing in a way that we deem purposeful, valuable, functional, we would be really excited about that as part of their development. But just the knowledge of a child being autistic, suddenly, because we've been taught and trained that autism is a disorder, it is a set of symptoms and faults and inherent wrongness, suddenly the same behaviors are perceived differently. And what I've come to understand over time is that actually just the knowledge of neurodivergence was actually skewing my understanding of that child's play. But for both of those children, lining things up was intrinsically motivating. It might have served a different function. It might have been carried out for different reasons, but each child's play was equally valuable. And so it set me off on a bit of a journey to thinking, actually, is it that children who are neurodivergent can't play or don't know how to play, or is it that we as adults just do not know enough about the different play patterns? And so what I started to do within my own role as an area inclusion consultant is actually, rather than judging play, I started to be more curious about it. I started to develop something called a play dictionary, where if a child was engaged in a particular type of play that I didn't quite understand, I would gather information about that so that I could build upon that play. Similarly, another thing that I will often observe when I am out in early years settings is this behavior known as self-stimulatory behavior, so stimming, and it's something that you're probably all very familiar with. It's when a person engages in a repetitive action and it is related often to a form of self-regulation. Now, we're often taught about stimming in relation to self-injurious or harmful behaviors, but what we now know, and there's a lot of research out there now, that actually self-stimulatory behaviors, stimming, there are many, many different types that children will engage in. And in a lot of ways, it is much more than self-injurious and harmful. It is a way of expressing, it is a way of processing, it's a way of communicating. And music therapists are looking at it in terms of its musicality kind of elements or traits, and also that it is a playful behavior. But what's really interesting is because historically stimming has been something that has considered to need to be stopped. So, for example, we have had interventions in the past where if a child hand flaps, for example, they will have their hands held down so that they are trained out of that stim. So because there's a historical association with this being quite an abnormal or a behavior that's not socially acceptable, we can sometimes either ignore it, overlook it, or attempt to stop it. And I was out in a setting recently and a practitioner said, oh, I've got this child and he absolutely loves hand flapping. He does it all the time. And she said, I can see that it's a form of expression. He's doing it very playfully. You know, the very nature of self-stimulating behavior is that it regulates the nervous system. And so she had all this knowledge of this child. So she knew this child quite intimately. However, she'd also read that engaging in self-stimulating behaviors was not socially acceptable. So if you do a Google search of stimming, lots of the articles are about how it looks weird, how it's not socially acceptable, how it might make others feel uncomfortable. And so this practitioner in that moment dismissed her own knowledge of the child because she'd read something that she thought took priority. And so she said to me, I think I'm going to discourage it because I don't want him to get bullied when he's older. I don't want people to think he's weird. And so we had to have a real in-depth conversation about the playfulness of that child's stimming. And we spoke about the importance of trusting the knowledge of individual children. And the reason I'm referring to this particular anecdote is because often when I'm doing training on play, I'm often preaching to the already converted. So practitioners and educators will often have such an intricate knowledge of their children that they will know inherently this is meaningful to the child, this is valuable to the child, this is regulating, this is joyful. But because of that wider framework, that deficit framework of thinking that actually our job is to essentially normalize all children, we can sometimes overlook our own intuition and our child development knowledge. And so if we're going to embrace play within early childhood, we have to acknowledge some of the issues that are leading to us denying or rejecting children's play. Louise, you've said we experienced this recently at a transition meeting with school, and the teacher said that the child would need to learn to stop stimming as it was disruptive in the classroom. So yeah, Louise, you're rightly horrified with that. I think once you are over your horrified bit, it's then thinking about perhaps sharing some tools and resources with that teacher to actually show the different functions of stimming and why actually she's probably going to encounter much more disruption if she stops the child stimming, who is then unable to self-regulate, who is then likely to flip his lid or flip her lid and have a meltdown. So yeah, you're rightly so to be horrified, but that can be a real teachable moment for that person to think about. Actually, you're going to encounter much more disruption by stopping the stim. You know, we need to free and liberate the stim. Okay, so we're going to think a little bit then about play and ableism, because essentially the big question that educators will ask me is, why are we in this situation? And why do we have this idea that play is so inherently, or that indifference is so inherently wrong, which we know that it's not? And it's this systemic issue of ableism. So as I said earlier on, ableism is the favoring of typical minds and non-disabled bodies. Our entire education system is built on an ableist mentality, and controversially, the very systems designed to help children. So if we think about systems of inclusion, how we identify special educational needs, it might feel quite uncomfortable to hear, but those systems, despite the fact that there are many people within those systems wanting to make a difference, they are built upon this idea that there is something wrong with the child and we need to get them back to this idea of normalcy. The very definition of SEN, for example, is about children not being at age-related expectations, about having more difficulties than their peers. There's nothing in there about, well, what if that child actually has lifelong differences and they're on an entirely different developmental pathway from their peers, not a less than, not a worse than one, but just a different pathway. So ableism is a human-invented system. We create this system and structures that uphold the idea that there is a right or typical way to be. And this is communicated to us continuously from our earliest years. And the idea is that we must all strive to comply for this idea of normalcy in order to be accepted and to have value. School readiness, for example, is an ableist idea. It's getting children to all fit into a one-size-fits-all so that they progress through the school system and later contribute to the wider economy. So when you have human difference or diversity within that, that becomes a threat. So it is driven by anti-diversity, and the process of normalization begins from conception through to birth and throughout our lifespan. The biggest ways in which we see it in early childhood is through targeting the way in which children play, develop, and learn. So we really have to acknowledge and confront and interrogate how ableism shows up in our early childhood settings. As humans, we are constantly bombarded with implicit and explicit messages that to fail at being normal means you have a deficiency and you are in need of being fixed or corrected. So how does this translate to children's play then? One of the biggest issues we have with play, and play is wonderful and there's so much unbelievably good research, but what we have to acknowledge is that most of what we know about play is based on research that centers neurotypical and non-disabled play and learning. So if you're only really studying the way in which typically developing children play, That then becomes the definition and measure of accepted play. So, for example, if you're thinking about the way children engage in imaginative play or role play or parallel play or cooperative play, and you are essentially saying neurotypicalism is the gold standard, or being non-disabled is the gold standard, anybody that then plays differently, they fail that measure. Where that becomes a huge issue is that play is then used as a mechanism through which children with developmental differences and disabilities are judged as incompetent, deficient, or unskilled in their typical development. For example, we've seen massive issues with the theory of mind concept in early childhood, and this idea that autistic children don't possess empathy and therefore that's why they can't engage in cooperative play. Theory of mind has been debunked. It is not an accurate theory of autistic development. So we see these theories emerge which kind of then reinforce this child is inherently not able to do something. If you're then identifying and you're measuring children amongst this typical definitional gold standard of play, you're then going to start to turn to play-based interventions, and they become the method by which play and the child are corrected. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have play-based interventions, and personally, I do not prescribe to the idea of intervention in any way. I think what we are actually doing in early childhood is we are attuning to children and doing what is developmentally meaningful for them. So absolutely, if a child is having difficulties or they are struggling, we absolutely should step in, but I don't think that intervention is what we are essentially doing. We're actually meeting the child where they are at. So play-based programs, I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, but actually, if you look at most play-based programs or interventions, if you look at the outcomes and the goals of those interventions, they are often about normalization, teaching and training the child how to be normal or how to mask so that they appear normal. So, for example, we've seen play-based interventions in recent years that really focus on children using listening ears and sitting still and having quiet hands. And actually, we call that play-based, but it isn't play-based at all. It's more about getting the child to be still rather than unruly. So where is this an issue then? If children are being exposed to play-based interventions that are about normalization, they are then being deprived of the opportunities to engage in self-directed play. And this further disadvantages their well-being, their opportunities to self-regulate, their development and their learning. This leads to many play terminologies and definitions. So the reason that defining, not that we should want to define play, but the reason it's hard to describe what play is because there are so many different words for it now that it can be really, really confusing. And that's something that I've picked up in my doctorate research, is that there's just so many words for play. And what we need to get back to is self-directed play. We need to get to the heart of, if we want to learn about children, we need to move on from this idea of children learning through play and thinking about what we learn from their play. And we learn so much from their play through the way that they are self-directed. Kelly, you've just said there, is targeting learning wrong then? Absolutely not. If you see an opportunity to support a child's learning and development, and it might be that there is some involvement in their play, absolutely not. However, when you're thinking about targeting their learning and development, you've got to ask yourself the question, is it developmentally meaningful to the child? So is what I am teaching or is what I am supporting in terms of their learning actually meaningful to them? Or am I getting them to behave in a way that doesn't feel natural to them? So if we think about Sophia's comment above, imagine you set a play target for an autistic or an ADHD child that's about increasing their eye contact up to 30 seconds during playful interaction. Having playful interaction with a child, amazing. Forcing eye contact, not so good. So absolutely you can target learning, but know the difference between targeting learning and encouraging masking or engaging in that normalization. So I'm aware of time, and actually what I would really like to do for this next 7 or 8 minutes is actually think about some of the patterns of play that you might see in young children. Now, we are in an hour's webinar. I am not going to do justice to all the wild, wonderful and dynamic ways that children play. So I'm going to focus specifically, because it comes up so much, some of the ways in which our autistic children play. Now, we've got to be really mindful that play is, as I've said several times, it's dynamic and it's vibrant. Each child will have their own play identity, their own play patterns. So some of the things that I'm about to share with you are not to suggest that all children will play in this way. It's about you then applying your unique knowledge of the child to understand their unique play patterns. And one of the things that you might want to make use of, that I will often use when I'm out in settings, is I will think about the child's play patterns or their play spectrum by thinking about what are they intrinsically motivated by, and then thinking how I might support. And one of the things that I really emphasize when we're thinking about children's play patterns is never judging a play pattern as deficient or impaired or a deficit or a symptom. The play might at times make me feel uncomfortable, or I might think, oh, we might need to think about some pro-social ways of developing that play, but I don't inherently think that play is wrong. It's just, play is just play. It's a way of being in the world. So using the play spectrum can be really useful for thinking about what is intrinsically motivating for the child, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. So there is a researcher called Carmel Khan, who has done some beautiful research in exploring specifically autistic play. She's written a number of articles now, but one of the ways in which she's learned about the way autistic children play is she has created these adult biographies. So she spent a lot of time with autistic adults, getting them to remember or getting them to have moments where they think about the way they played as children. And it is an article that I would encourage everybody to read, and it is called Sensory Highs, Vivid Rememberings and Interactive Stimming. And what Khan drew out from this article is that there are some themes in the way that autistic people play, and these are their own patterns of play and forms their own culture. What Khan also picked up on is that because not all these forms of play are directly linked to learning, and that sometimes they were overlooked or not seen as valuable or intrinsically meaningful to the individual. Kate, if you look at the bottom of the slide, the article is listed there. So it is Sensory Highs, Vivid Rememberings and Interactive Stimming. So at the bottom of this slide is the name of the article, and I'm happy to follow up with a copy of it afterwards, because it might be behind a paywall. So what are some of the ways then that autistic people play, or what did Khan find in her article? She found that autistic people very often would speak about sensory highs, engaging sensorially within space, objects and people. So there is a term that I was reading yesterday in another article, and it said sensoryisms. So children are very sensory driven. Every child will have their own unique sensory portrait, and it's important for us to understand their unique sensory portrait. But what she found is that children would often, or the adults, refer back to being children and engaging in play that gave them that sensory high. So there was one example of a child that for a really long time would just pick the sand up and let the sand run through their fingers, or a child that would press the buttons of something and get real joy out of the click of the keyboard. Now, you see that when you observe your children. We often talk about triggers in early childhood settings, what's triggering a child's sensory experience, but we also need to look for the glimmers, the things that really give them those highs. And you might observe a child doing something and it might seem quite repetitive, it might seem quite rhythmic, and one of the ways in which you can really help to develop your own perception of that play is to do it too. So I had a situation this week where I had a practitioner that said, all this child does is run up and down. And I said, well, you run up and down as well, and you see what that gives you. What do you get from that motion? So really connecting with children in mirroring what they're doing. What we also know about autistic play is that there will be a longer period of solitary play, and solitary play is often stigmatized in early childhood as something abnormal. Play, again, is so multifaceted, and what we know for a lot of autistic people, they will talk about the reason for them being motivated by solitary play is because the world for an autistic person, what you've got to bear in mind, it's like the dial is turned up to the highest capacity. Being in a neurotypical world, and a world that is loud and so much going on, sometimes it's through play that you can decompress, you can self-regulate, you can experience relief. And so that solitary play, that real immersion, can not only intrinsically motivate the child, but it reduces social demands. And what we also know about autistic attention and the way autistic children develop their attention is through something known as monotropism. And monotropism also explains why autistic children will often have special interests. They can get a lot of pleasure and a lot of joy from deeply immersing themselves in something. It's why you'll often find that autistic children will find it difficult to transition from one task to the next, because their monotropic brains will become really deeply engrossed in something. And there's nothing greater than being deeply engrossed in solitary play. It's why we see a lot of teenagers and a lot of grown adults who will engage in gaming. They will use lots of gaming activities. We also know that autistic children are often whole body players. So they like highly physical play. They like to be in the outdoors. Some of the research around why autistic children like to be outdoors is because there is less pressure to conform to these ideas of normalcy. There's more freedom, and you get that kind of natural fresh air. You've not got as many kind of rules being applied to the way in which you play. We also know because autistic people can have interoceptive and proprioceptive and vestibular differences, that actually being able to really interact with their whole bodies helps with their sensory integration. So I had a situation yesterday where an educator said to me, I've got a child that loves to push and pull on everything. Like everywhere he goes, he's pushing and pulling. And she said, I've previously perceived that as him being badly behaved. And she said, what I can now see is he's actually looking for that sensory input. He's getting so much joy from that pushing and pull. So we thought about some heavy work activities for this particular autistic child. We also know that autistic people, you know, the very big trope about autism is this lining things up. Yes, lots of autistic people like to line things up, but what it actually comes down to is that interest in repetition, pattern seeking, creating mental rules, organizing and collecting. If you lean in to the repetitive behaviors of autistic children, you will be amazed at the things that they can create and the extensions within their learning, rather than trying to stop it or redirect, or what some therapists will refer to as sabotaging their play so they play in more normal ways. What we also know is that whilst autistic children might not necessarily engage in conventional role play, they will be drawn to pretending or reenacting things. So, for example, I always think back to my own childhood. The thing when I was observed playing teachers, I wasn't necessarily interested in the teachers. The thing that I love to pretend to do is when a teacher did the register, and I don't know if anybody was around in the 80s and 90s where you had those registers where you would do just the little horizontal tick on that register form, and there was something so pleasurable as a child as creating that. So people might have thought, oh, Kerry's being a teacher, but it was actually that pretending of filling in the register. So they're just a couple of patterns, and there are some others that I want to speak to you about that anecdotally come from autistic players. So Stimpunks, who is an autistic, Ryan Boren runs the website Stimpunks, and he collects lots of examples of autistic ways of being and other neurotypes. And something that's been picked up by a lot of autistic people is this idea of penguin pebbling. So if you haven't heard of it before, it's essentially Penguin colonies, basically, so penguins, and when they want to interact with each other, the way that they will initiate interaction is they will give each other pebbles, and they are initiating, I want to interact with you. And that's also been found to resonate in autistic play. So what you will find is that autistic children won't necessarily go up to another child and say, can I play with you? Or they might not necessarily interact in conventional ways, but what we have and what is anecdotally observed is that they will penguin pebble somebody. So for example, they may come up to an adult that they really like, and they may just gently pass you a toy or hand over something. I had a student at my university the other day talk about her autistic child, that when her child wants to interact and play with her, he will put something close to her mouth. He'll try to put things in her mouth. And she realized that even though he's non-speaking, she speaks to him a lot, and she speaks to him with a very playful intonation. And so he's encouraging her, I want you to speak to me. So penguin pebbling is very, very common. It can also be a way to develop friendships. So what you will notice with autistic children, whilst a lot of autistic children will have special interests, they will also be interested in what other people are interested in. So if they hear that a friend really loves something, and they might go and learn about that thing in order to be able to have a conversation with them about that thing. The other thing that's been noticed, and this is apparently quite common in autistic girls, is that whilst you might find that a child won't engage in conventional role play or imaginative play, they will be very driven by the setup. So, for example, imagine a small child setting up a doll's house. They might spend ages setting up all the rooms and putting it all out and laying it out, but then won't play with the doll's house. So there's something in the setup and the creation of something. It's why a lot of autistic children like Lego, because you're setting the thing up, but you then don't necessarily play with it. One of the things that you might notice is with computer games. So a lot of autistic people report liking games where you get to do that, like The Sims, or when I was a bit younger, I was obsessed with setting up Theme Hospital. So I am getting a little bit of a time warning now, and I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to talk about this last one, which is object personification. So research has found, and this is a little bit sad as well, that because autistic children, their ways of being is often so rejected across their childhoods, they will often engage in something known as object personification. And the object personification is basically becoming deeply attached to objects, essentially. So getting a real deep fascination with a thing. So it could be a pebble, or it could be a particular plushie or toy. It could be a random thing that they found in a setting, and you might find that they stick it in their pockets and they never want to let it go. So object personification is essentially developing a deep love of something that is inanimate. It doesn't necessarily have to be a something, but it is a something to the child. This really resonates with me. I personify everything. So in my world, everything has feelings, and people find it really odd, but it's just the way my brain works. So there are a couple of more examples across the slides that I'm not going to have time to go through today, but you'll be able to look at them yourselves, and they will be provocations. There is also a website that I'm going to share with Joe called Fantastic Diversity. So with Fifi Benham, who is also neurodivergent, we have written 50 fantastic ideas for supporting neurodiversity, and within that there are ideas for supporting play, and we also have a companion website which you will gain access to. And that brings me to the end with 3 minutes for any questions. I'm so sorry that I always notoriously overrun, but hopefully you found that somewhat useful. And thank you so much for sharing your I can see people are sharing their children's way of playing. A random plastic bottle, yes. A cherry tomato, oh my goodness, that is really cute. So sleeping with a cherry tomato. So yeah, object personification. And then Louise, you said my set and ethos is that of loose parts. We don't have things like plastic. Yes, so Louise, I think loose parts is absolutely amazing. And if anybody is aware of James Nursery Nook, he does lots of stuff around that. What I would say is I absolutely believe in the ethos of loose parts. But what I've also found for some neurodivergent children, that actually that can be really disorientating as well. So always make sure that you do have access to those commercial things as well, because what we know, for a lot of neurodivergent ways of thinking and being, is those deep attachments to some of those commercial interests can be really, really valuable for the development of language and engagement with the world. So yes, absolutely all for the loose parts. I think it's really freeing, but some children might really, really love Barbies, for example, and that would also be really, really important to account for that as well. But it sounds like actually the autistic and neurodivergent children within your setting are benefiting. So yes, Joe, I'm going to be quiet now because I am totally